The Plaza has existed since 2011 as a museum that tells the many untold stories of our community here in Los Angeles, in the Latino community of Los Angeles. And we're really pleased to have with us tonight Elsa Flores Almaraz to talk about her husband, Carlos Almaraz, who was one of the most and remains one of the most celebrated Chicano artists of our time. Whose works will live on for many, many, many years. We have an exhibition that opens tonight called Evolution of Form that details a lot of Carlos's early works that show the evolution of his style. We had planned to have a great opening reception here tonight with a lot of people and wine and cheese and great times. The virus gods deemed otherwise. So we're going to make the best of it, and we're going to present it virtual with a walkthrough with Elsa and with Dr. Susana Smith Bautista, and they'll talk to you a little bit about Carlos's life, explain some of the images that are here, and you'll learn a lot more about this fascinating artist who made such an important contribution to our world of art. I especially want to thank Elsa for making this collection available to us. Elsa, we really appreciate it. We're very, very hopeful that we'll be back to normal and that you can come and see the exhibit yourself at some time soon. And we are also planning to show the documentary that was made on Carlos's life later in the year, and we'll bring Elsa back from her home in Hawaii. So we'll let you know when that comes up. But for now, we want you to grab a glass of wine, put on some comfortable clothes, and enjoy this walkthrough of the exhibit. So with that, turn it over to Susana.
Hi everybody, I'm Susana Bautista. I'm the Senior Curator at Large here at La Plaza de Cultura y Artes, and I'd like to welcome you all. First, before we start, I want to do a couple of thank yous and recognitions. Thank you again, John, for your support of this exhibition. I want to thank Jimena Martin, the Senior Curator of Education and Programming, who was involved from the very beginning in helping us visit the studios. I want to especially thank the installers, Sergio and Steve, because they braved the pandemic to actually come down here and install and go look for magnets and just they did an incredible job. And for the porters who also were here working, because we do recognize that this is a difficult time. We recognize that everyone wants to be home and that there are tragedies happening. But as John said, #Art Matters. And that's why we're all here. And we thank you for being with us. So I want to, before I start talking about the exhibition, again, give a big, big thank you to Elsa Flores Almaraz, who is an incredible artist and was also the wife of Carlos Almaraz. I want to thank her for making this work available to us. Thank her for making the documentary available to us that you will see later on, for her curatorial insight and expertise, and for keeping the memory and the artistic legacy of Carlos Almaraz alive.
Thank you, Susana and John and everyone here at La Plaza de Artes Culturales. Anyway, thank you all for being here, and I hope you're cozy and in your jammies, sitting and watching this. We're gonna run through the exhibit. Susana's gonna lead, and we're gonna talk very much about the history and the evolution of mostly Carlos's early work, which people are not familiar with. And it's going to be a great insight as to how he evolved his imagery into what we knew of the last 10 years of his life. For those of you who don't know Carlos Almaraz, he was an amazing imagist, artist, well loved in Los Angeles and the Southwest, just about to break through internationally when he was stricken down by AIDS in 1989. So it's been 30 years since he's been gone, and we're just excited that his legacy continues.
So as Elsa said, one of the premises for our exhibition here today is to really show some of the earlier influences in his life, which are perhaps not as well known. And that's his period in New York, which we're going to talk about first, and then his life in the 1970s, and then also to show some works of art that haven't really been shown in decades. And we'll talk about those as well. There's one downstairs in particular. So let's first take a look if you can span right here, these three works, which were all done in 1969. Now, Carlos first went to New York in 1962 with his good friend Dan Guerrero. And then he came back to LA because he wanted to finish up his studies. And then he came back in 1965 and stayed until 1970. So this period was really influential, not only because it opened up a whole new world of the fine visual arts to Carlos, but because of what was going on in that art world at the time. So at the time, we have artists such as Sol LeWitt, Daniel Judd, Carl Andre. For example, this is what was happening in the 1960s in New York. Very minimal, very hard-edged, geometric lines. So while Carlos was very much influenced by this, he also wanted to do it his own way. And as we can see in these works, we see that he definitely adopted this notion of a grid composition. It's very linear, it's very hard lines, but he's filling them with his own stories. And Elsa talks about these beautifully when she says that they are, quote, a primitive alphabet through which he would try to construct a universal language. Now, LACMA had an incredible retrospective of his work for the Getty's Pacific Standard Time, and the curator Howard Fox did an amazing job. But unfortunately, I have just one problem because Howard Fox said that these early works were quote unquote stifled. And he said, Almaraz appears as a quote, dislocated minimalist wannabe. Now, I am going to argue with that because he is not a wannabe. He's not trying to mimic what was happening in New York. He's doing it his own way. And not only that, but we see the importance of this influence with the grid and the composition that Carlos brings to the rest of his artistic life. And also, it's important to remember that this is not the only thing he was doing in '69. So this is what we're going to show you in this first gallery. So if you come right over here, you can see this work right here, which is called American Sampler, from 1986. And you can see how similar is this notion of a composition. And then we're going to look later on at a similar one from 1989, where he keeps this notion of the grid. Now, of course, he's doing it in his own style. He's doing it with color. He's, again, inserting his images in there. But it's this notion of the grid that he would always keep with him. And so if we look 1 year later, from 1969, we see these two images here in 1970. And these are really quite different. And this is what's important to remember in this room, because the evolution that we're going to talk about is not a linear evolution. It is almost cyclical. And that, I think, is important to remember. Again, you see here the grid starts to explode. The edges, the lines are exploding. This was done in pastel, and the early black and whites were done in graphite. And then we see, right over here, we see this figurative work that he was doing at the same time. And this was also 1970. So again, I argue that he wasn't a slave to what was happening in New York. He took it in his own way. He was inspired by it. Now, Elsa's going to talk about what he was doing 1 year later in 1971, after Carlos had returned to Los Angeles, and he was starting to work with the collective Los Four.
And I might add that to the grid discussion, that some of the more minimal grids, like that you'll see in the show, the graphite pieces, Carlos was very interested in the universal language, and he wanted to crack that code. He knew that the arts were important in communicating beyond language, and when he had a near-death experience, he was actually taken on this journey with these aliens, an alien ship, and they discussed the universal language. And in that discussion, they said it was made up of 6 symbols. And you'll see those symbols in many of these pieces. So this particular piece was based on a Dada exercise called the Exquisite Corpse. And Carlos and Los Four at the time, Carlos introduced this exercise because he was just, so worldly. He had been in New York and he had studied art history and he'd studied all the museums around the world. And the Dadaists were doing this exercise where you would take one piece of art and several artists would take it and make it theirs and change it and paint over or draw over each other's pieces. And this is one of those pieces because during the time of Los Four, they were exploring the aesthetic of the barrio and making art in the barrio. And one of the more traditional known aesthetics is spray paint and graffiti. And he was in, as well as Judith Hernandez, were in a show at the San Francisco Museum called Graffiti. I believe that's the name of the piece. So this is one of those pieces where they're using spray cans. And this piece was cut out of a stretcher bar, so it may have been much larger. That was also part of the aesthetic back then, or the ideology of making collective work and making work that's not owned by a gallery or a museum. So, everyone got a piece and took it home. So this was but you do see some of Carlos's iconographies here. You see the calavera with the wings, the angel wings. You see this nude woman. And so the imagery that evolved from the abstract grid compositional pieces began to take figurative form, which is what Carlos really was all along. That's why he struggled so much in New York, because deep inside, he was a figurative artist. He was Mexicano and very emotional, very passionate. And when he finally broke loose of the New York construct, he finally got to really express himself in the way that he's meant to do.
So before we go on to more works from 1971, I just want to show you this piece right here, which is the latest piece that we have in this exhibition from 1989, the year that Carlos died. And this one's called Purple Grid. So again, bringing back this notion of the grid and how it was always there underlying in the form. Now, again, Carlos did it his way. And this is definitely representational and figurative and color and autobiographical. But you can see the grid is still underlying there.
Well, one other thing I'll mention about this was done in '89, and this is the year of Carlos's death. And so the palette is much darker. He was dealing with his mortality, and normally the palette would be a high key, much brighter. But he was dealing with that, and the buffo here, which was a recurring figure in his work, represented himself, like the youthful folly and all that entails in being the court jester as an artist, and feeling that a lot of regret for his getting to this point where he was losing his life and all that he had loved and worked for. So that's what we see here, and again, lots of iconography. The boat represented passing into other realms, ships sailing in the night. He had anthropomorphic figures, and they're all rushing out of their spirit bodies, it appears to be. And so yeah, this is one of the swan pieces that he created.
So if we come over to this wall over here, we see 3 very different works which go back to 1971. And again, we get to see a little bit of the artistic genius of the different ways that he was thinking at the same time. And if we can talk first about the return, and just to make a transition from this 1989 grid, I think Elsa wrote once that Carlos's life was a series of births, of deaths and rebirths, symbolic and almost literal. And so 1971 was right after he had come out of a near-death experience, being in a coma. And so he returning to LA, returning to life. He had vowed never to drink again, never to go back to New York again, which he did, but in a very different way. So do you want to talk a little bit about this one, Elsa?
Yes, this piece, The Return, is a seminal piece because he had, as Susana had just mentioned, he had spent 41 days in a coma from having he almost drank himself to death, basically. So he had acute pancreatitis. He was given last rites. He was on his way out. He had left his body and hovered over the gurney and was heading towards the white light. That's when he encountered the aliens and had that journey. But when he came back into his body, this is one of the first pieces that he produced. And you can see like all that was like evoked in his hospital visit. Like here he is in this hospital bed, and there's all these sexual iconographies, which became part of his visual language. And you know, obviously this is very sort of Los Angeles. It represented his return to Los Angeles, and also the cultural iconography, like the bleeding heart, which is very Mexican, and the hand of God shooting down, and then, you know, and then he's also very funny. So he's got like farts coming out, and lots of
body parts.
Lots of body parts, a lot of sexual language and situations.
Yeah, so speaking about Carlos's sense of humor, I wanted to talk about the title of this work, which is really funny. And this was done in, again, 1971, the same year and the same period. So the title of this one is Goodbye, Carrie. Take back your heart, I ordered liver.
He was so funny.
And again, it's very personal, very emotional, a lot of color, bursts of color. Again, you have the bleeding heart symbols, you have the knife, you have the airplanes, the rain, the color clouds that we'll talk more about in the other room.
Here are the UFOs.
Mm-hmm. And then if we can just look over here, we get a very different idea about what he was doing at the same time in black and white. Noche de los Pingos. So it's like the same work, same autobiographical, same symbols, but devoid of color. So at the same time, he was playing with color, and he was still also influenced by the black and white.
And his cultural iconography began to develop here too, because the Pingos, the Diablos, were very much part of Latin culture and the church and all that entails. So we see very clearly from the graphites, the early graphites, the grid and minimal graphites, that this is like he's taking off again back into his visual language.
I want to draw your attention to this work. It's a very small work. It's a gouache on paper, but it's really, really beautiful for a number of reasons. First of all, again, the title. So I have to read you the title, which is very funny. So it says, Esta es la historia de un brujo que se perdió en su dibujo buscando el sol. Este pobre chicano despertó de su sueño pidiendo agua. This is the history of a wizard, or witch, or that got lost in his drawing looking for the sun. This poor Chicano woke from his dream asking for water. So this one was done in 1972, just like these other two ink drawings. And so this was 1 year after the works that we just finished looking at. And again, you can see this notion of a grid, the composition here. And again, he's filling it with his own imagery and iconography. But what I want to also bring to your attention is the influence of we go back to Carlos's years in New York. And when he was living in New York, he just ate up all of the culture that was there. He went to the New York Museum, he went to the Philadelphia Museum of Art, he even went around Europe and looked at the great masters there. He was so inspired by the art world. And in particular, I want to talk about Paul Klee. So Paul Klee was an artist that Carlos actually specifically writes about his genius and about seeing his work. at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And this work reminds me a lot of that. And so here we have, for example, so Paul Klee was a Swiss artist, died around 1930, and worked in very small scale, but also inspired by Cubism and Surrealism and very linear geometric works.
And you can also see when he went into sort of a storyteller mode as an artist, the grid served that, because now he also had a fascination with animation. So now it's like a storyboard. It's as he's able to convey lots of different stories, and his mind was filled with them in this form.
So let's move on over to the case here. And we have a number of historical documents and sketchbooks, but I want to talk about these historical documents because not only are they really fun to look at, but they talk a little bit also about his personal evolution. So we have right here his resident aliens border crossing ID card, which I guess is the equivalent of a green card.
It was pink then.
Yeah, pink card, which he was 4 years old. The address is East Chicago, Indiana, and so he had moved from Mexico City to Indiana and then Chicago at the time. And his name is Carlos Almaraz, right? That's the name he was born. So then we see right over here his elementary school card from Humphrey Elementary School in East LA, where he's 11 years old, and all of a sudden he's Charles Almaraz.
When they moved to Chicago, his dad really wanted him to integrate into American society, so they changed his name from Carlos to Charles David Almaraz. And then later, during his born-again Chicano period, which is what I call it, he returned to Carlos, his given name.
Yeah, but this is his certificate of naturalization. He was 18, and he was still Charles David Almaraz. So it wasn't until, as Elsa said, he came out of his coma. He was in the middle of the Chicano movement, the civil rights movement in the 70s, that he found himself. And in fact, there was a journal entry that he put in 1967 that says, quote, "I think perhaps that I am really a Carlos. I don't look like a Charles, but feel less like a Carlos. I have to remember, however, that my mother named me Carlos." And that was just part of the back and forth struggle that he continued all of his life, which we saw in New York and in LA. And here, Elsa can talk about his trips to China, which were also incredibly important.
Well, Carlos was not only a prolific artist, like creating thousands of works and never stopping to create. No matter where we traveled, he'd bring his supplies and he'd get out of the car or in the hotel room and he would draw. But during from New York on, he created about 87 journals that we access to use in the film, and also we use in many of his exhibitions, because he was, again, so prolific. And
It's like poetry.
Yeah, it's like
when you read
poetry.
them. It's
And he's a
beautiful.
poet too. There is poetry in many of his journals. This first one is a sketchbook, and there are many of these, of his color studies. I mean, he learned from the masters in New York and around the world, and they're just like color on color, and that's why, he's such a vibrant colorist.
And just to note, this is 1969.
Mhm.
So this is the same time as we were looking at those black and white grids that he was exploring color.
And then during his reawakening, his rebirth after having almost lost his life in 1971, he became very political. He joined Cesar Chavez in the Farm Workers Union up in the Central Valley. He went to work with them. He did murals for the conventions and did their magazine, their newspaper, El Malcriado. And during that time, it was very political for many of us, many of the activists of the time, with the Cultural Revolution happening around the world. So he did have the opportunity to go to Cuba and to China as well, in a cultural exchange. So he has sketchbooks of his time in China. He really admired Mao because Mao was very much about the arts. And then he went to Cuba as well, where he was sort of talking about Mao, and he almost got kicked out of Cuba for that because he was carrying his little red book around. But yes, he was very much politically active and was a socialist and a Trotskyite and a Maoist, just to explore, because that was his style. He just dove into whatever he was looking for and exploring and studying.
So in this gallery, we've included some black and white photos from Elsa Flores Almaraz from 1975. And the reason why we've included them is because we wanted to give you a different idea about what was happening in the 1970s in LA for Carlos Almaraz. And most people tend to focus on his involvement with El Movimiento, the United Farm Workers, as Elsa said, his reawakening as a Chicano activist. But actually there was a very strong arts movement happening in LA, and especially downtown. This was the beginning of the downtown arts movement. Artists were starting to move into downtown. And what Elsa does in some of these photos is that she documents some of the performances and the artists that were happening at the time. And so we have from 1975, we have Roberto Gil de Montes. We have, starting in the 1980s here, a couple of photos of Carlos. I think this was 81, the year that they got married. And Carlos and Elsa both lived in a studio in Spring and 8th Street. They actually had studios right above each other.
We actually, I lived in Highland Park, he was in Echo Park when we were dating, and then he moved in with me the day that John Lennon was murdered, because he said life was too short. So he moved in with me in Highland Park. But yes, during the 70s, I mean, I always had my camera with me. I was a fine art photographer, and later went back to my first love, which was painting. But during that time, I would follow the movement, all the artists that I worked with, and did also family and friends. So this is my tia Julia, and she was so funny, and I loved Julia so much. So she was a very welcoming model for me. And down below that, Roberto Gil de Montes, we had lots of parties with different artists at his homes. And so that was him in his bathroom. Hope you're watching, Robert. And then Louis Perez and I still have a lifelong collaboration, and Louis is quite the performance artist, and I would follow him and document him, as well as talk to him and create new performance art pieces. This was in my studio window at 8th and Spring Street, and Louis sitting at a window, and there's his reflection and some lipstick on the window. And right next to him, well, below is Renee, which was again, and Victor Durazo here, who is now long departed, a ballet folklorico dancer and dear friend of mine. And again, one of these art parties. They were always costume or theme parties. And right next door, we have Louis Perez, who created this cross and did a performance art piece called Let's Put an End to This Nightmare. And that is that piece there. And he was walking through the 3rd Street tunnel. Below him is at Murals of Aslan at the Craft and Folk Art Museum in the 80s, early 80s. Carlos and I were just dating, and the mural behind him was by Judith Hernandez. And I captured this piece of Carlos looking at his mural through a reduction glass, and I just thought it was very poignant.
That's a great title, isn't it? Don't look back.
Don't look back, don't look behind you.
Don't look behind you.
Yes. And then we move over to the piece in the corner, which is Martha, another folklorico dancer. She was at my studio and was modeling for me. And right below, we had already been married, and Carlos was at my mom's house for Thanksgiving dinner, and always the joker, just hilarious. He would always break out in song and dance, or put on a costume or make a mask, and in this case, this is called the Muffin Man, because he put some Thanksgiving muffins on these glasses and did a Carlos on us. So yeah, I really enjoyed this whole series. I also followed the whole Chicano punk period of the early 80s and documented quite a bit of that. And I liked working in very small, intimate sizes, because you can really get in there and be part of what's there. It's very intimate. And I printed these all in my darkroom.
we see more examples of Elsa's influence on Carlos, and we see a very different type of influence. We see an influence, a painterly influence, with oil and impasto, and so I'd like Elsa to talk about her works, and then this is Carlos's Bunny Boy, and then anniversary piece over here.
Yes. Well, the influences, of course, went both ways, and Carlos taught me so much mostly about color and form. And in this particular piece, this is my piece, it was done in the 80s, and this is Carlos's piece, Bunny Boy. And I had returned to my painting again as my first love, but I was still photographing, and Carlos was probably one of the most photographed artists around because I've always had my camera. So we were each other's models so often, both in painting and photography. So I was using a lot of thick paint, and as you can see here, this is Encaustic, which is wax and oil paint, and just to really build up the surface. I really love what paint does, and I love building that up. So Carlos, in the past, in the early 70s and early 80s, would be painting very flat with acrylic. And he liked what I was doing, so he would come over and we'd shared the studio at this point. And he would look at my work and he'd go back and then he'd start building up some of his paintings, like Bunny Boy. In fact, that's a pet name for him. We called each other Bunny Boy and Bunny Girl. So this is a self-portrait of himself, Bunny Boy. Always a stage piece. So yeah, he started building up and articulating the surface of his paintings. I think I might have been an influence, and I hope so. I know that he influenced me in so many ways. There's a better example of the Encaustic that I love doing in this piece, which is owned by Frank Romero and Patrick Gila. We're not sure who owns it, but they loaned it to the exhibit. And here you can see, if you come in close, you can see what the paint is doing, which I just adore. Just love that, that it's paint. You're really allowing the paint to do what it wants to do. And again, the image is very, very fertile, very much about the feminine figure and goddess-like. And this is a particular water maiden, water goddess.
And so then if you look over here at anniversary piece, you can see how Carlos really uses the thick buildup with the oil painting here.
Yes, he did this for our anniversary. I think it was our, what year is this? 80, I think this was our third anniversary.
This is 83.
Oh, it was our second anniversary. We were married in 81. And yeah, so it's all about love. But yes, you can see in the surface, he also started adding gauze. You see like these swaths of texture. And he would add sand or gauze to really kind of give it more of a textured articulation.
And then if we continue over here, we can see another oil on canvas from just a few years later, called End of an Era. Again, very thick, painterly surface. But what's important about this piece is this was done in 1986. It's called End of an Era, and it hasn't been shown since it was first exhibited at the Jan Turner Gallery, probably shortly after it was made.
So again, a lot of painterly articulation. And that's Carlos in the lower left-hand corner as the artist holding a paintbrush, and he would often wear baseball caps. And often chairs were part of his iconography, and to him the chairs represented the passing of time and also the seat of power.
So we tried to think about what he could have meant by end of an era in 1986. And so we did a Google search, and we found that there was actually a major fire at the LA Central Library downtown. And so if you look up top, you can see some buildings on fire. And so we think that's what he was referring to as end of an era. But of course, there's a lot of other autobiographical images that he's put in here, such as the jester over here on the right, and there's the monkey with a clown hat. And So right over here, we see another one from 1985 in pastel called Face of Fear. And do you want to talk about this one?
Well, Face of Fear is quite an interesting piece because it's done in 1986. This was prior to his diagnosis of AIDS, which he was diagnosed in 1987, and he passed 2 years later. And so it didn't refer to that, but I think it referred to all of the fears and insecurities that he carried as a person, as an artist. As you see, there are lots of demons that were worked out through his works. And I believe this is just a reflection that they were always with him, and he was working them out through art.
And this was probably one of the happiest times of his life when we think about it, really, because his daughter Maya was a couple years old. You had probably already just bought a house in Hawaii. He was successful. He had gone back to New York, and he had a great gallery selling artwork there. And so I think it's important to remember that even at the top of his game, personally and professionally, he was still going through a lot of conflicts inside of him.
And often when you see a feminine figure, he said that they would represent his anima, his feminine side, his female. And you see here, these looks like lovers here, kissing or discussing, and this face kind of coming forth as, kind of the fear. And it brings to mind, I was just reminded while watching this, that Carlos did have a primal fear that I would leave him after 7 years of our relationship. He thought that I would kick him out and he would wind up a loner in an East LA hotel room after 7 years. He had this thing about transformation, and he would say that every 7 to 10 years he would completely transform into a very different person. And it was true. If you look at his timeline, artistic and personal, he would make those transformations. He was a seeker, and he would consciously work on his own personal transformation, his self-realization. So I believe there's a figure which I don't see in any of these pieces called the Wanderer, and that's a reflection of his fear of being abandoned or left alone.
So talking about transitions, we're going to go back from 1985 to 1971. And we're going to show you two very different types of work that he was doing in 1971. So at the same time that he was doing spray can murals, and this is a similar one that we just saw that Elsa can talk about this one. This was very different than the other spray can because this is very, very minimalist. I was saying that it's almost like a Chicano Jackson Pollock. It's a drip painting. You can't see really any of the figurative elements in it.
Absolutely, and again, it's just part of his continual exploration with paint and form, and going back to the basics that he learned in New York. Prior to New York, he was a figurative artist. And so this was later carried through into his figurative pieces, his representational pieces, just in the use of color and layering of paint.
And remember, this was also done at the same time that he was working with the Los Four in the collective murals. So if you can span across over here, and you see these 4 pastels, we realize that he's doing these at the same time in 1971. And all of these have what I call a color cloud. But what's interesting is that what we see raining down is, it could be rain, it could be teardrops, but also the clouds are so full of symbols. The clouds have eyes, they have airplanes in them. Over here, there's Saturn in them. There's a bleeding heart in the clouds. And you see not only what's coming down from the clouds, but you see what's going up into the clouds. So here you have the rockets. Over there in Socks, you have also rockets that are shooting up into the cloud. And then over here, this one's really interesting because this one Carlos did for his mother. And this is called Our Lady of the Roses and the Tears. And Carlos Carlos's mother was Rosa. But again, you have this notion of what's coming down from the clouds. Yes, it's rain, but there's also tears. And so this idea of joy and sadness, this duality that Carlos always had in both his personal life and his art. And so his mother is painted here as the Virgen de Guadalupe on top of the serpent and the crescent with the halo.
Yet you see the other figures that you see in a lot of his work, a lot of the sexual images and the eyes of God and lips, and so yeah, and Saturn, which again, remember this, he was fresh out of his near-death experience and his journey through space. It's fascinating with
so these are like dreamscapes. You know, these are part of the hallucinations that he had, some of the images that he had from that time. And the way that he brings all of these colors and these images together, it is like a dreamscape. And so we go from 1971 to something a little bit more familiar, because we didn't want to leave out what I know all of you were looking for, is the car crashes. So we have a few of those to end up with. But again, from very different years. So we don't want you to leave thinking again that it was a linear evolution. And that's the whole point, is that at the same time, he was going through so many different styles at the same period. And so the car crashes that we have are from, let's see, let me get one.
And for those of you who do not know Carlos's car crash series, he was very well known for two genres in particular. One was the car crashes, and the other were eco parks, which is an inner city urban park, which you'll see in the next painting.
So this one was from 1979, and this is called Another Crash in acrylic.
And as you can see, it's a police car crashing. Again, he would add some of his politics during that time. And for him, Carlos said that the car crash represented the clash of culture and modern man, the clash of technology, the clash of the sexes. So it was very representational for him. They weren't gory. He didn't mean them ever to be that. He reckoned them to a cartoon you'd see any Saturday morning.
And over here we have, again, one of his other iconic works about Echo Park, but it's also not boring. And so this is from 1974, and there's two things that are really interesting about this painting. One of them are these yellow horizontal lines, which some people say, oh, you know, why did he do that? Was that a mistake? Did he just not? No, it's definitely the line and the grid that is still there in this composition. And also we can see on top something falling from the sky. It could be angels, it also looks like flames, could be a little bit of both. And so it's not just a typical day in Echo Park there. And then over here, we have from 1981, Solo Crash.
This piece belongs to my daughter Maya, our daughter Maya, who is the only car crash that he was able to leave her because of the Carlos's gallery. He was very successful in galleries at the time, and everything he gave the gallery would sell. So he was able to stash this away for his daughter. This is called Solo Crash.
And then we're going to end up on the last one right here, which is 1988. So 1 year before he died. And what I love about this one is that it's actually done in watercolor. He really didn't do, especially his car crashes, a lot in watercolor. And it's just beautiful the way that the watercolor really makes all the colors just blend in with each other. And it's powerful, it's colorful, but it's very clean. The lines are clean.
I have a funny story too. When we first started dating, my mom gave me high sign because I said, "Mom, you're so old." She says, "No, they're the best, son los mejores." And so I would pick him up. We had the Wednesday and Saturday night dates, and someone had crashed his car on Echo Park Boulevard. He lived in one of the houses overlooking the park, and I became the driver. And I hadn't seen his recent work. I only knew of his political work, which was kind of cartoonish. I didn't think they were fine art. And then when he did go back into his studio after having left his movement work and his political paint work, his political artwork, I had gone into a studio, and from floor to ceiling there were these masterpieces. And I realized the mastery of this man, the genius of this man. And so I was afraid actually to let him drive, so I did all the driving.
So I just wanted to add one thing that I read about Carlos that I thought was really important. And he was talking about when he met you, that he was teaching kids at Plaza de la Raza.
So was I.
And you were, right. And somebody else was?
Louis Perez,
That's right.
David Hidalgo,
A bunch of artists.
Lobos.
And he said that that experience was so important for him because he said it wasn't about the finished product. And so he learned that art was a process and that you just had to do it. And it was really very existential. And that I think is so important as we walk through and we start to understand a little bit more about his process, and not just about the finished product, but about really understanding himself and the art and the work through it all. So we thank you for being with us, and we hope that you learned a little bit more about Carlos Almaraz, and we hope that you can come and see it in person, but no promises just yet.
I do hope you get to come see it, because looking at them up close and personal, you can see all the nooks and crannies and all the handwork that went into it. So with luck from the gods, the gallery will be open.
Thank you all.
Thank you, mahalo.
Okay, so here we have an amazing painting, La Conquista, which is a gouache on paper from 1972. And this work has never ever been shown before. So this is an exclusive here at La Plaza de Cultura y Artes. What is so amazing about this work, it's what I call the Chicano Guernica. And I want to bring to your attention Picasso's masterpiece, Guernica, which he did in 1937. And really both of these works, La Conquista and Guernica, they were artists that were trying to depict somehow the devastating violence and anguish that happened in very different times. Spain in the fascist civil war in the 1930s, and of course the Spanish conquest of Mexico in 1519. And so the conquest of Mexico was a theme that really influenced and affected a lot of Chicano artists. But what Carlos is trying to do here is he is trying to talk about the anguish of the conquest. You have, perhaps these are the two white devils with a horn here. You have very symbols of Mexico like the cactus and opal. You have the rifle. And then you have here, which could be either a dog or a coyote. And then over here in the bloody red section, you have what could possibly be a pata de cabra, which is a goat's foot, which in Mexico is symbolic of a bad omen or the devil. And so in this truly amazing masterpiece, you have La Conquista, which is Carlos's feeling of what was happening and what happened to Mexico with the Spanish conquest. So this piece was actually restored, and Elsa can talk a little bit about the restoration that was done to it.
Yes, this piece I found rolled up in an old tube, and I sent it to be restored. And what Carlos did back in the day when he was, a poor artist, is he worked in house paints and lots of inexpensive art materials. And this piece he had taped up onto the wall. You can still see there's masking tape, which is not archival, that held it down. And so the archivists cleaned it up and made it acid-free somehow, however they do that. and they put it on this archival rice paper. And it's pinned up right now with these amazing magnets that are holding it in place. It's an acrylic, and it was just so overjoyed to see it up on the wall. And I love that the comparison to Guernica. Yeah, very true.